The locomotive's whistle cut through the still morning air like a blade, its mournful cry announcing the arrival of another passenger to the small town of Red Bluff. Eleanor Vance pressed, her palm against the window glass, watching the dusty platform grow closer with each turn of the wheels. In her chest, hope and terror wrestled for dominion. She had traveled 1,700 miles from Boston, leaving behind a life of quiet desperation for the promise of a future she had only dared to imagine in her most secret dreams. A husband, a home, a place to belong. She stepped onto the platform with the careful composure of a woman who had been taught never to show weakness. Her modest blue dress pressed and clean despite the journey, her dark hair tucked neatly beneath a bonnet. In her gloved hand, she clutched a letter, the last correspondence from a man named Samuel Croft, a widowed rancher who had described in careful, hopeful words the life they might build together. The platform was nearly empty, and as the train pulled away, releasing a final hiss of steam, Eleanor found herself standing alone, searching faces that were not there. The station master, a man with a gray beard and kind eyes, emerged from his small office, a ledger tucked under his arm. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before, a mixture of pity and resignation. "Miss Vance?" he asked quietly, and when she nodded, he produced a folded telegram from his pocket, his movements slow, reluctant. "This came for you yesterday. I was hoping the train would bring you something else." But his voice trailed off, and he pressed the paper into her hand before retreating back into his office, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor unfolded the telegram with fingers that had suddenly gone cold, the paper crackling in the silence. The message was brief, brutal in its finality. Samuel Croft had reconsidered. A woman from town, a widow with land of her own, had offered a more practical arrangement. He wished Eleanor well in her future endeavors. The words blurred before her eyes, and for a long moment, she forgot how to breathe. She had sold everything she owned for this chance. There was no return ticket in her pocket, no family waiting to welcome her back. She sank onto a wooden bench near the station wall, the telegram crumpling in her lap. The morning sun, which had seemed so promising from the train window, now felt harsh and accusing, exposing her humiliation to the empty platform. She watched a wagon roll past, a dog trot across the street, a woman hang laundry on a line ordinary lives, continuing as if her world had not just shattered. The tears came then, silent and hot, tracking paths down her cheeks that she was too exhausted to wipe away. She had never felt so completely, utterly alone. The sound of small footsteps on wooden planks barely registered at first, just the rhythm of childhood, carefree and light. But then the footsteps stopped directly in front of her, and Eleanor looked up to find two small faces studying her with open curiosity. Twin girls, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with matching braids the color of honey and eyes that seemed too wise for their young faces. They wore matching dresses faded from washing, and they stood shoulder to shoulder as if facing the world together, their small hands intertwined. One of the girls, the one with a small freckle on her nose, took a tentative step closer. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice high and sweet, cutting through Eleanor's despair like a thread of gold. The other twin tugged at her sister's sleeve, whispering something Eleanor could not hear, but the first girl shook her head firmly. "Mama always said we help people who are sad." The mention of a mother spoken in the past tense sent a small ache through Eleanor's chest that had nothing to do with her own grief. Before Eleanor could find her voice, a shadow fell across the bench, and she looked up to see a man approaching, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind, his hat held in his hands as if he were approaching something sacred. The twins turned at the sound of his footsteps, and the second girl, the quieter one, ran to him immediately, wrapping her arms around his leg. The first remained, her gaze fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that belied her years. The man's eyes met Eleanor's, and in them she saw something unexpected, not pity, but recognition. "Papa, she's crying," the first twin announced, as if her father might not have noticed. The man knelt beside his daughter, his hand resting on her small shoulder, but his eyes never left Eleanor's face. "I see that, Lily," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "Rose and I were just getting supplies," he continued, addressing Eleanor now. "But it seems my girls found something more important." There was no awkwardness in his words, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that made Eleanor's tears fall faster. Eleanor tried to speak, to explain, to offer some excuse for her public display of grief, but the words would not come. She held up the telegram instead, her hand trembling, and the man, this stranger with gentle eyes and a daughter wrapped around his leg, took it from her with the same care he might use to handle something fragile. He read it slowly, his expression unchanging, and when he looked up again, there was something in his gaze that had not been there before. Understanding, perhaps, or the memory of his own grief. The man folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, as if it were something worth keeping. He stood, and Eleanor realized he was taller than she had first thought, his presence somehow filling the empty space around him. "My name is Daniel," he said simply. "These are my daughters, Lily and Rose. Their mother passed 2 years ago." The girls pressed closer to him at the words, and his hands settled on their heads with an unconscious tenderness that made Eleanor's heart clench. "I know what it is to be left standing alone when you expected to be met." He glanced down at his daughters, then back at Eleanor, and something shifted in his expression, a decision being made, a risk being considered. "We came to town for fabric," he said slowly. Rose tore her dress climbing a fence she was told not to climb. The quieter twin Rose ducked her head, a small smile playing at her lips despite her apparent embarrassment. "The mercantile is just down the street. Would you walk with us? Help us choose the right color? I'm afraid my taste is limited to what doesn't show dirt." The request was so unexpected, so utterly ordinary in the midst of her extraordinary despair, that Eleanor found herself nodding before she could think better of it. She rose from the bench, her legs unsteady, her carpet bag still clutched in one hand. Lily immediately reached for her free hand, her small fingers warm and trusting, and Rose emerged from behind her father to take the other side. Daniel smiled, a small tentative thing that did not quite reach his eyes, but promised something more. "Fair warning," he said, falling into step beside her. "They will talk your ear off about ponies." The walk to the mercantile was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. Lily talked, as promised, about a pony she had seen at a neighbor's farm, a spotted creature she had named Buttercup in her imagination. Rose contributed the occasional observation in a softer voice, her observations surprisingly astute for a child her age. Daniel walked beside her, his presence steady and undemanding, asking no questions about her past, her pain, or her plans. He simply accompanied her. And somehow, in that simple act, he gave her permission to simply exist in the moment, rather than drowning in what she had lost. Inside the mercantile, the girls led Eleanor to a shelf of fabric bolts with the enthusiasm of explorers discovering treasure. They debated the merits of blue versus yellow with a seriousness that made Eleanor smile, the first smile she had managed since the telegram. Daniel stood back, leaning against the counter, watching the scene with an expression that held something raw and unguarded. When Eleanor looked up and caught his eye, he did not look away. "You're good with them," he said quietly, and there was a weight beneath the words that Eleanor did not fully understand. The fabric chosen, the soft yellow that Rose had declared happy, they made their purchases and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight. The town was busier now, and Eleanor felt suddenly exposed, aware of her status as a woman without purpose in a place where purpose was everything. She turned to Daniel, prepared to thank him for his kindness and find her way to whatever meager accommodation she could afford with the coins left in her purse. But before she could speak, Lily tugged at her skirt, looking up with those impossibly earnest eyes. "Are you coming home with us?" Lily asked, as if the matter were already settled. Eleanor opened her mouth to explain, to refuse, to retreat into the politeness that had always been her armor. But Rose added, in her quieter voice, "We have a spare room. Mama used to say it was for guests, but we never had any." Daniel knelt between his daughters, his hands on their shoulders, and looked up at Eleanor. "They're not usually this forward," he said, a hint of warmth in his voice. "But I find I'm inclined to agree with them. Stay, just for tonight. Get your bearings." Something in Eleanor's chest cracked open a wall she had built years ago, in a house where she had never quite belonged, in a life where she had always been too much or not enough. She looked at this man, this stranger who had found her at her lowest and offered not rescue, but company. She looked at his daughters, who had seen her tears and offered not questions, but small, warm hands. And for the first time since the train had pulled away from Boston, she felt something other than fear. "Just for tonight," she heard herself say, and the smile that broke across Lily's face was like sunlight after rain. The homestead was a half-hour's walk from town, a modest cabin set against a backdrop of rolling hills and an enormous sky that seemed to stretch on forever. As they approached, Lily and Rose ran ahead, their laughter echoing across the open land, and Daniel fell into step beside Eleanor, close enough that their arms nearly brushed. "I meant what I said earlier," he said, his voice low, meant for her alone. "I know what it is to be left behind, to build a future on a promise someone else decides to break." He paused at the gate, turning to face her. "It took me a long time to believe I deserved something better." Eleanor stood at the threshold of his home, the twins waiting in the doorway, their faces bright with expectation. Daniel had not moved from the gate, leaving her space to choose, to decide for herself whether she would cross into this new life or turn away. She looked at him, this quiet man who had seen her broken and offered her his wholeness without condition. She thought of the telegram in his pocket, the dream she had buried on a dusty platform. And then she thought of small hands reaching for hers, of a voice that said, "Mama always said we help people who are sad." Eleanor stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a life she had never planned, into a family she had never dared to hope for. And behind her, Daniel closed the gate with a soft click, not trapping her, but welcoming her home.